I was kicked out of my home after my son's wedding. My daughter-in-law convinced him, saying I would be a danger to raising the kids, that I might sell them if I needed money. I left in silence. When the truth came out, my son ran into my arms. But that moment felt like a lifetime away as I stood there, suitcase in hand, trying to process what had just happened. The morning after David's wedding should have been filled with joy. I should have been sitting at my kitchen table, still wearing my smile from the night before, maybe looking through the photos on my phone and thinking about how handsome my son looked in his tuxedo. Instead, I found myself face to face with Claire, my new daughter-in-law, in the hallway of what I thought was my temporary home. "We need to talk, Margaret," she said, her voice carrying that particular edge I'd noticed during the wedding preparations but had chosen to ignore. I'd been staying with them for 2 weeks while my apartment was being fumigated.
Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching.
Something David had insisted on. "You can't just show up whenever you want anymore." I set down my coffee cup, confused. "Show up?" David invited me to stay here while... That was before we really understood the situation, Claire interrupted, her arms crossed. She was still in her silk pajamas, her blonde hair perfectly styled even first thing in the morning. Everything about her screamed control, precision. "We've been talking, and we're concerned about your financial desperation." The words hit me like cold water. Financial desperation? I worked part-time at the public library, lived modestly but comfortably in my small apartment, and had never once asked them for money. "I don't understand what you mean." Claire's laugh was sharp, calculating. "Margaret, please. You're living paycheck to paycheck, working at that little library job at your age. We know you're struggling." She leaned against the doorframe, blocking my path to the kitchen where I could hear David making breakfast. "And now that we're planning to start a family, we can't have someone around who might be desperate enough to do anything for money." My hands started trembling. "Anything for money? Claire, what are you suggesting?" "I'm saying that when people get desperate, they make desperate choices. And I won't risk having someone around my future children who might. Well, who might sell them if the price was right." The accusation hung in the air between us like poison. Sell them. She thought I would sell my own grandchildren. The woman who had changed David's diapers, who had worked 3 jobs to put him through college, who had never missed a single one of his baseball games or school plays, was being accused of being capable of trafficking children. I couldn't even finish the sentence. The words were too horrible to repeat. "Look, I'm not saying you would definitely do it," Claire continued, her tone shifting to fake sympathy, "but we can't take that risk. You understand, right? As a mother, you'd do the same thing." I heard David's footsteps in the hallway behind Claire. My son appeared, still in his pajamas, his hair messy from sleep. He looked tired, probably from the wedding and the honeymoon activities they'd been planning. "Morning, Mom," he said, then noticed Claire's posture. "Everything okay?" Claire turned to him, her expression instantly shifting to concerned wife. "Honey, I was just explaining to your mother about our concerns, about having her around when we start our family." David's expression changed. I watched my son's face, the face I'd kissed better after countless childhood injuries, and saw something I'd never seen before. Doubt about me. "Mom," he said slowly, "Claire and I have been talking about this for a while. We think it might be better if you found your own place again. Soon. My apartment will be ready in 3 days, I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. I was never planning to overstay. "No, that's not what I mean." David rubbed his face with his hands. "I mean long term. We think you need to understand that things are different now. Claire and I are building our own family, and we need space to do that without complications. Complications, that's what I'd become to my own son. A complication." Claire stepped closer to David, slipping her arm through his. "We're just worried about the children's safety, Margaret. You understand. When people are financially struggling like you are, sometimes they make choices they wouldn't normally make. We've read about it happening." "Read about what happening?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "Grandparents who sell access to grandchildren, or worse." Claire's voice was steady, matter of fact, as if she was discussing the weather. "We just can't take that risk." David nodded slowly, and I realized this wasn't a spontaneous conversation. They had planned this. My son and his new wife had sat down, probably multiple times, and discussed whether his mother was capable of selling children. And they had decided that yes, I might be. "I want you to leave today," David said, not meeting my eyes. I'll help you get your things together. I stood there in that hallway, wearing the same nightgown I'd worn when David was little and would crawl into my bed after nightmares. And I realized that the nightmare was happening now. My own son believed I was capable of harming children. My own grandchildren, when they came. David, I whispered, trying one last time. You know me. You know I would never. I thought I knew you, he said, finally looking at me. But Claire's right. People change when they're desperate. And honestly, Mom, your situation is pretty desperate. I felt something break inside my chest, something that had been holding me together for the 67 years of my life. It wasn't just my heart breaking. It was my faith in everything I thought I knew about love, about family, about the son I'd raised to be kind and thoughtful and fair. I'll pack my things, I said simply. As I walked to the guest room where I'd been staying, I could hear them talking in low voices behind me. Claire's voice carried a note of satisfaction that made my skin crawl. She had won something important here, something she'd been working toward since the moment David put that ring on her finger. I packed my few belongings in silence, my hands moving automatically while my mind tried to process what had just happened. When I was done, I stood in the doorway of their house, the house where I'd helped paint the nursery when David was a baby, where I'd spent countless holidays and birthdays. I'll call you, David said awkwardly, not quite able to meet my eyes. But we both knew he wouldn't, not for a while, not until Claire decided it was safe. I walked to my car in the cool morning air, placed my suitcase in the trunk, and drove away from my son's life. In the rearview mirror, I saw Claire watching from the window, her expression satisfied. She had successfully removed the threat to her future family. Me. The drive to my apartment was a blur of tears and disbelief. How had 24 hours changed everything so completely? Yesterday, I'd been dancing at my son's wedding, proud and happy. Today, I was a woman accused of being capable of selling children. But as I unlocked my apartment door and stepped inside, something unexpected happened. Through my tears, through the devastation and shock, I felt the smallest flicker of something else. Something that would, over the next few months, grow into something much stronger. I felt curious about who Claire really was, and what else she might be capable of. The first week in my apartment felt like living in a fishbowl made of silence. Every morning, I woke up expecting to hear David's voice calling from the kitchen, asking if I wanted coffee. Every evening, I found myself reaching for my phone to text him about something I'd seen or read, then remembering that I was now the woman he thought might sell his children. I'd taken a leave of absence from the library. I told my supervisor, Mrs. Henderson, that I had a family emergency, which wasn't exactly a lie. The emergency was that my family had decided I was a potential criminal. On Tuesday morning, I was sitting by my kitchen window with my third cup of coffee, watching the neighbor's cat chase birds it would never catch, when I heard a gentle knock at my door. Through the peephole, I saw an elderly woman with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, holding a covered dish. "Hello, dear," she said when I opened the door. "I'm Dorothy Chen from apartment 3B. I brought you some soup. I noticed you moved in recently, and you looked a bit lost yesterday in the mailroom." I accepted the soup gratefully, and before I knew it, Dorothy was sitting at my small kitchen table, telling me about the building's quirks and the best times to use the laundry room. There was something deeply comforting about her presence, something that reminded me of what normal human interaction felt like. "You know," Dorothy said, stirring sugar into the tea I'd made, "this building has seen a lot of stories. People come and go, relationships change. I've been here 15 years, and I've learned that sometimes the most beautiful people carry the ugliest secrets." Something in her tone made me look up from my cup. "What do you mean?" Dorothy was quiet for a moment, as if deciding whether to continue. "Well, about 2 years ago, we had a young woman living in 2A. Lovely girl, or so we all thought. Blonde, very put together, always smiling. She was dating this sweet man, Michael, who would visit every weekend. He was so in love with her you could see it from space." My chest tightened slightly. "What happened to them?" "That's the strange part. She moved out suddenly one day, and Michael came by looking for her. He was devastated, said she'd just disappeared without explanation. But here's what was odd. She'd been telling everyone in the building that Michael's family hated her, that they were trying to turn him against her." Dorothy shook her head. Poor man was so confused. He kept saying his family had never even met her. I felt a cold prickling along my arms. Did she tell you her name? Claire something. Pretty name. Can't remember the last name. But I'll tell you what stuck with me. She had this way of talking about people. Very sweet on the surface, but underneath, Dorothy made a face like she'd tasted something bitter. She once told me that Michael's mother was the type of woman who would do anything for money. Said it like she was just making conversation, but there was something cruel about it. The soup in my stomach turned to ice. Claire? Oh yes, definitely Claire. You know, it's funny you ask. She reminded me of my daughter's friend from high school. Same pattern. Beautiful, charming. But somehow every relationship ended with the other person being painted as the villain. Dorothy looked at me carefully. You seem upset, dear. Did I say something wrong? I set down my teacup with shaking hands. Dorothy, this Claire. Did she ever mention anything about having concerns about people around children? About grandparents being dangerous? Dorothy's eyebrows shot up. Now that you mention it, yes. She told Mrs. Patterson from 4C that Michael's mother was unstable around children, said she was worried about future grandchildren. We all thought it was odd because Michael seemed like such a family-oriented young man. She paused. Why do you ask? Do you know someone like this? I couldn't speak for a moment. The room felt like it was spinning. Claire had done this before. The exact same script, the exact same accusations, the exact same pattern of turning someone against their own family. Dear, you look pale. Are you all right? Dorothy reached across to touch my hand. The Claire you're describing, I managed to say. I think she might be my daughter-in-law now. Dorothy's face went white. Oh, no. Oh, sweetheart. No. I told Dorothy everything. About the wedding, about the accusations, about David choosing Claire's version of reality over his own memories of me. As I spoke, Dorothy's expression grew increasingly horrified. This is exactly what she did to Michael, Dorothy said when I finished. Exactly. She isolated him from his family by convincing him they were toxic. Then she disappeared when she found someone better. But you're saying she married your son? 2 days ago, I whispered. Dorothy was quiet for a long moment. Margaret, I need to tell you something else. After Claire moved out, I ran into Michael at the grocery store about 6 months later. He looked terrible, like he hadn't slept in weeks. He told me he'd found out some things about Claire, things that made him realize she'd been lying about his family. By then, it was too late to repair the damage she'd done. What kind of things? He wouldn't give me details, but he said she had a history, a pattern of doing this to men, using the same tactics over and over. He'd hired someone to look into her background after she disappeared. Dorothy leaned forward. Margaret, I don't think Claire is who she says she is. That evening, after Dorothy left, I sat in my living room as darkness fell around me. I didn't turn on the lights. I just sat there, processing what I'd learned. Claire had practiced on other people. My son wasn't her first victim, and the accusations against me weren't original thoughts. They were part of a script she'd perfected, a systematic way of destroying family relationships. But why? What did she gain from isolating David from me? I thought about her behavior during the engagement, how she'd slowly started making comments about me being old-fashioned in front of David. How she'd suggested that my financial situation was concerning and that I might become dependent on them. How she'd gradually poisoned every conversation with subtle implications about my character, my stability, my motives. She'd been preparing David for this moment, conditioning him to see me as a threat so that when she finally made her move, he'd be ready to believe her. My phone buzzed with a text message. For a wild moment, I hoped it was David, but it was just a reminder about my dentist appointment next week. David hadn't called or texted since I left his house 5 days ago. I wondered if he was thinking about me at all, or if Claire had already filled his head with more poison about why it was better that I was gone. But now I knew something Claire didn't know I knew. I understood what she was, even if David didn't yet. The question was, what was I going to do about it? Part of me wanted to call David immediately, to tell him about Dorothy, about Michael, about the pattern. But I could already imagine how that conversation would go. Claire would have prepared him for this too. She'd probably told him that I would become obsessive and paranoid, that I would make up stories to try to get back into their lives. If I confronted this head-on, I'd just be proving her right. David would see exactly what she'd predicted, a desperate older woman making wild accusations. So I made a different choice. I decided to be patient. I would watch and wait and document. Because people like Claire, people who operated through manipulation and lies, eventually made mistakes. They got overconfident or sloppy, or they pushed too hard. And when that moment came, I would be ready. Over the next few days, I established a new routine. I returned to work at the library, where my colleagues welcomed me back with gentle smiles and careful questions about my family emergency. I told them everything was resolved now, which wasn't technically a lie. I had resolved to handle this differently than Claire expected. I started a small notebook where I wrote down everything I remembered about Claire's behavior during the engagement. Every comment, every subtle manipulation, every time she'd steered David away from spending time with me. Patterns emerged that I'd been too trusting to see before. I also wrote down everything Dorothy had told me about Michael and the previous Claire. I realized I needed to find Michael, to learn more about what Claire had done to him and how she'd been exposed. But mostly, I worked on myself. I read books about emotional manipulation, about narcissistic behavior patterns, about how to rebuild self-esteem after psychological abuse. Because I was beginning to understand that what had happened to me wasn't just a family disagreement, it was abuse, carefully planned and expertly executed. Claire thought she'd won by getting rid of me. She thought she'd successfully isolated David and cleared the path for whatever came next in her plan. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated me. I wasn't the desperate, financially unstable woman she'd painted me as. I was a 67-year-old woman who'd survived the death of her husband, who'd raised a son on her own, who'd worked and saved and built a life through decades of small, quiet acts of strength. And now I had something I hadn't had before. I knew exactly who she was. The war wasn't over. It was just beginning. 3 months had passed since I'd left David's house, and I'd settled into a rhythm that surprised me with its peace. I worked my shifts at the library, tended to my small herb garden on the balcony, and filled a notebook with observations about Claire's patterns. What I hadn't expected was how much stronger I felt with each passing day. But Claire hadn't been idle. The first sign came from my sister, Linda, who lived 2 states away. She called on a Thursday evening, her voice carefully neutral in a way that immediately put me on alert. "Margaret, I got the strangest call today," she began. "From your daughter-in-law, Claire. She was asking about your mental health." I set down my cup of tea and moved to the window, looking out at the parking lot where normal people lived normal lives without having to worry about character assassination campaigns. "What exactly did she ask?" "She said she was concerned about you living alone, that you'd been acting erratically since Richard's death. She wanted to know if I'd noticed any signs of instability." Linda's voice carried a note of confusion. "Margaret, she made it sound like you were having some kind of breakdown. She mentioned something about you making inappropriate comments about money and children." There it was. Claire was expanding her reach, making sure that even family members who lived far away would have doubts about my mental state. It was brilliant, really, in its calculated cruelty. "What did you tell her?" I asked. "I told her she was talking nonsense, that you're one of the most stable people I know, and that if she had concerns about you, she should talk to you directly instead of calling family members behind your back." Linda paused. "Margaret, what the hell is going on? Why is your son's wife calling me asking if you're mentally ill?" I told Linda a simplified version of what had happened. I didn't mention Dorothy's revelations about Claire's history. That still felt too precious, too strategic to share widely. But I explained about the accusations, about being asked to leave, about the silence from David. That manipulative little. Linda caught herself. "I'm sorry. I know she's your daughter-in-law, but this is sick behavior. Who calls someone's sister to plant seeds of doubt like that? Someone who's building a case," I said quietly. "Someone who needs everyone to believe the same story." Over the next few weeks, I learned the scope of Claire's campaign. My neighbor across the hall, Mrs. Rodriguez, mentioned that a lovely young woman had stopped by asking if I seemed stable, if I had visitors, if I appeared to be managing my finances well. The woman had identified herself as my daughter-in-law, concerned for my well-being. My dentist's receptionist made an odd comment about hoping I was getting the help I needed. When I pressed her about it, she explained that my daughter-in-law had called to update my emergency contact information and had mentioned that I was going through a difficult period mentally. Even Mrs. Henderson at the library pulled me aside one day. "Margaret, I hope you don't mind me asking, but is everything all right at home? Someone called here asking about your work performance, whether you seemed confused or forgetful. They said they were family, concerned about your well-being." Each revelation felt like a small knife wound. Claire was systematically poisoning every aspect of my life, ensuring that wherever I went, people would already be primed to see signs of instability, desperation, or mental illness. But instead of breaking me, each discovery made me more determined. I started documenting everything in my notebook: who Claire had contacted, what she'd said, when the contact had occurred. I asked for details from everyone she'd spoken with, and a clear pattern emerged. She always presented herself as the concerned daughter-in-law. She always mentioned my financial struggles and mental state, and she always planted the seed that I might be dangerous around children. The brilliant part was that she never made direct accusations. She just expressed concerns and asked people to keep an eye on me. It was manipulation disguised as care, poison wrapped in the language of love. The cruelest part was that David believed he was protecting his future children from a genuine threat. Claire had made him think that keeping me away was an act of responsible parenting rather than psychological abuse. I found Michael's contact information through a mutual friend at the library who knew someone who knew him. It took 3 weeks of gentle networking, but eventually I had his phone number. I called him on a Sunday afternoon when I knew I'd have privacy and emotional energy for whatever I might learn. "Hello?" His voice sounded tired, wary. "Michael, my name is Margaret Walsh. I got your number from Dorothy Chen. She said you might be able to help me understand some things about a woman named Claire." The silence that followed was so long I thought he might have hung up. "Claire Morrison?" he finally asked, and I could hear something like pain in his voice. "I think so. She's married to my son now. She was living in Dorothy's building about 2 years ago." Jesus. The word came out like a breath. She got married? To someone with a family? "Michael, I think she did to my son exactly what she did to you, and I think she's not finished." He agreed to meet me for coffee the next day. I spent that evening wondering what I would learn and whether I was strong enough to hear it. Michael was younger than I'd expected, maybe in his early 30s, with kind eyes that carried too much knowledge about betrayal. We met at a small cafe near the library, and he ordered his coffee black like a man who'd lost his taste for small pleasures. "She told me you were dead," he said without preamble. "My family, I mean. She convinced me that my parents and sister had written me off, that they'd said terrible things about me. She had this way of making me feel like she was the only person who really understood me." I nodded, recognizing the pattern. "What happened at the end?" "I hired a private investigator after she disappeared. I was desperate to understand what had happened to us, why she'd just vanished. What I found out," he shook his head, "her real name isn't Claire Morrison. It's Clara Moretti. She's done this to at least 3 other men that we could find. Always the same pattern. Isolate them from family, convince them that she's the only one who really loves them, then disappear when she finds a better target." My hands were shaking as I wrote this down. "Did she ever mention anything about children? About people being dangerous around children?" Michael's face went white. "That was her specialty. She told me my mother was the type of woman who would sell her own grandchildren if the price was right. She said my sister was mentally unstable around children, and that I should never let her babysit. She made me terrified of my own family. The exact same words, the exact same accusations. I felt sick and validated at the same time." "Michael, did the investigator find anything else about why she does this?" "Money and control, mostly. She targets men who have family money or stable careers. She isolates them, makes them dependent on her, then either bleeds them dry or finds someone with better prospects." He looked at me directly. "Your son has money?" I thought about David's successful accounting practice, his nice house, his savings account. Enough. Then she's not done with him. She'll isolate him completely. From you, from friends, from anyone who might question her. Then she'll either drain him financially or trade up to someone wealthier. Michael's voice was flat, Clinical. I'm sorry. I know this isn't what you want to hear about your son's wife. It's exactly what I need to hear, I said, because it means I can stop her. Michael looked skeptical. How? I tried to warn people about her, but she'd already painted me as the unstable ex. Nobody believed me. Because you tried to expose her directly. That plays into her narrative about bitter exes and jealous family members. I closed my notebook and looked at him. But what if we let her expose herself? Over the next hour, I explained my plan to Michael. Instead of trying to convince David that Claire was manipulative, I would simply wait for her to overreach. People like Claire always got overconfident. They pushed too hard, or they made inconsistent stories, or they tried to manipulate the wrong person. The trick is being patient, I told him, and documenting everything so that when she does slip up, there's a clear record of the pattern. Michael looked intrigued but doubtful. What if your son never sees through her? What if she's learned to be more careful? Then I'll have lost my relationship with David, but I'll have protected myself and maintained my dignity. And maybe I'll have prevented her from doing this to the next family. I smiled, surprised by how calm I felt, but I don't think she'll be that careful. She's gotten away with this too many times. She thinks she's invincible. As we parted ways, Michael gave me copies of the investigator's report. Reading it that night, I learned that Claire had left a trail of broken relationships and confused families across 3 states. Each time, the pattern was identical: charm, isolation, financial manipulation, and disappearance. But this time was different. This time, she'd married her target. This time, there was nowhere for her to disappear to without losing the prize she'd worked so hard to win. This time, she would have to stay and defend her lies. And that, I realized, was where she would make her fatal mistake. I was no longer the devastated woman who'd been thrown out of her son's house 3 months ago. I was a woman with knowledge, with allies, and with a plan. Claire thought she'd won by isolating me from David. She had no idea that isolation had made me stronger. 8 months had passed since that terrible morning in David's hallway, and I'd grown comfortable with my new life. My apartment felt like home now, not like a refuge. I had routines that belonged to me, friendships that Claire couldn't poison, and a sense of peace that came from understanding exactly what I was dealing with. I'd stopped expecting David to call. The silence from my son had become just another fact of my existence, like the weather or the rent. It hurt less now, partly because I understood it wasn't really David choosing to reject me. It was Claire's programming running its course. But I'd also stopped hoping for a quick resolution. I knew now that Claire was methodical, patient, and very good at what she did. If she was going to make a mistake, it would come from overconfidence, not desperation. I just hadn't expected it to happen at the grocery store on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in the produce section, comparing prices on apples, when I heard a familiar voice behind me. Claire's laugh, bright and artificial, the one she used when she was performing for an audience. "Oh, Margaret's always been a bit unstable," she was saying. "David worries about her constantly, but what can you do? You can't force someone to get help if they don't want it." I turned slowly, my basket of groceries suddenly feeling very heavy in my hands. Claire was standing near the organic vegetables, talking to an older woman I recognized but couldn't quite place. Both women had their backs to me. "It's so sad when elderly people lose their grip on reality," the other woman was saying sympathetically. "And you said she made threats about the children?" "Not direct threats," Claire replied, her voice dripping with fake concern. "But she said some very disturbing things about what she might do if she ever got desperate enough for money. David was terrified to leave her alone with future grandchildren." My heart started pounding, but not with the devastating pain I'd felt 8 months ago. This time, it was with anticipation, because I suddenly recognized the other woman. It was Helen Morrison, the head librarian at the main branch downtown. Helen had known me for 15 years. She'd been at my retirement party from the children's department. She'd sent flowers when Richard died. She knew exactly who I was and what I was capable of, and Claire had just made the mistake of trying to manipulate someone who actually knew me. "You know," Helen was saying thoughtfully, "that doesn't sound like the Margaret Walsh I know. She worked with children for over a decade, and we never had a single complaint. In fact, she was the most trusted employee we had. I watched Claire's posture stiffen slightly. Oh, you know Margaret? Very well. She's one of the most ethical, stable people I've ever worked with. Completely devoted to her son, too. I can't imagine her saying anything threatening about children. Helen's voice had taken on a cooler tone. Are you sure you're talking about the same person? Margaret Walsh, about 67, worked at our branch library? Claire turned slightly, and I got a good look at her profile. Her smile was still in place, but there was something sharp and calculating in her eyes as she tried to figure out how to handle this unexpected complication. Yes, that's her, Claire said, her voice a little less certain now. I mean, people can change, especially after traumatic events. David thinks his father's death really affected her mental state. I saw Margaret just last month at the library fundraiser, Helen said slowly. She seemed perfectly fine to me. Sharp as ever, actually. She was asking about volunteer opportunities working with children's literacy programs. I could see Claire's mind racing. She'd built her entire narrative around me being unstable and potentially dangerous to children. And here was someone who not only knew me well, but had recent evidence that contradicted every claim Claire had made. Well, Claire said, her voice tightening, I suppose she puts on a good act in public. It's the private behavior that's concerning. David has told me some very disturbing things. This was it. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. Claire was doubling down on her lies, even when faced with someone who had first-hand knowledge that contradicted her story. She was choosing to attack my character rather than backing down gracefully, and Helen Morrison was nobody's fool. That's interesting, Helen said, her librarian's instincts clearly activated. Because Margaret's son has never mentioned any concerns to me, and I've spoken with him several times at library events. In fact, just 6 months ago at the spring fundraiser, he was bragging about his mother's volunteer work and how proud he was of her. 6 months ago. That would have been just 2 months after Claire kicked me out of David's house, but according to Claire's timeline, David should have been terrified of me and worried constantly about my mental state by then. Claire had been caught in a direct contradiction, and I could see her starting to panic. Maybe you're thinking of a different conversation, Claire said quickly. David's been very private about the family situation. He wouldn't want to burden acquaintances with his concerns. The word acquaintances was a mistake. Helen had known David since he was a teenager volunteering at the library's summer reading program. Claire had just revealed that she didn't know the depth of Helen's relationship with our family. Acquaintances? Helen's voice was ice cold now. Young lady, I've known David Walsh since he was 14 years old. I was at his high school graduation. I gave him his first job recommendation for college. And I can tell you with absolute certainty that boy has never said a negative word about his mother in his entire life. I could see Claire's face from the side now, and her mask was slipping. The sweet, concerned daughter-in-law was being replaced by something harder, more calculating. Things change, Claire said, her voice sharp. People aren't always who you think they are. No, Helen agreed quietly. They certainly aren't. The two women stood there for a moment in tense silence. I could see Claire realizing that she'd made a serious error, that she'd tried to manipulate the wrong person with the wrong story. But instead of cutting her losses, she made an even bigger mistake. Look, Claire said, her voice dropping to what I supposed was meant to be a confidential tone. Margaret has been making some very concerning statements about money and what she might be willing to do to get it. David is worried she might even try to. Well, to exploit children for financial gain. It's a terrible thing to say about a family member, but we can't ignore the warning signs. Helen's sharp intake of breath was audible even from where I stood. Claire had just accused me of potential child trafficking to someone who'd worked with me in children's services for over a decade. That is a very serious accusation, Helen said slowly. Are you saying that David believes his mother is capable of harming children? We're just being cautious, Claire backpedaled, but the damage was done. Better safe than sorry when it comes to children's safety. Indeed, Helen said. And I'm sure you have some evidence for these concerns? Documentation of these concerning statements? Reports filed with appropriate authorities? Claire was trapped. If she claimed there was documentation, Helen could ask to see it. If she admitted there wasn't any, she'd be revealed as someone making baseless accusations about child endangerment. It's a family matter, Claire said finally. We're handling it privately. I see. Helen's voice was neutral, but I could hear the librarian's analytical mind working. Well, I certainly hope you're being very careful about sharing such serious concerns with people who aren't qualified to evaluate them. Accusations like that can destroy innocent people's lives and reputations. The warning in Helen's voice was unmistakable. Claire had just been told in no uncertain terms that she'd crossed a line. I watched Claire struggle with how to respond. She could double down and risk Helen asking more pointed questions, or she could retreat and admit that maybe she'd been hasty in her concerns. Either choice would damage her credibility. Of course, Claire said stiffly. We're very careful about who we discuss family matters with. I'm sure you are, Helen replied, and the skepticism in her voice was clear. Claire made some excuse about needing to finish her shopping and hurried away, her organic vegetables forgotten. I waited until she was completely out of sight before approaching Helen. Helen, I said quietly, I think I owe you a thank you. Helen turned and her face lit up with genuine warmth. Margaret, how wonderful to see you. I was just having the strangest conversation with someone who claimed to be your daughter-in-law. She was saying the most peculiar things about you. I heard, I said simply, and I think it's time I told someone the whole story. We spent the next hour in the grocery store's small cafe, where I told Helen everything. About the accusations after David's wedding, about Claire's history of manipulation, about the systematic campaign to destroy my reputation. Helen listened with the careful attention she'd honed through decades of helping people navigate complex information. This is psychological abuse, she said when I finished. And what she just did, trying to convince me that you're dangerous to children when she knows I have professional experience with you, that's not just manipulation. That's malicious. What do you think she'll do now? I asked. Helen considered this. If she's as smart as you say she is, she'll realize she made a serious error and try to contain the damage. But if she's as narcissistic as she sounds, she might double down and try to discredit me too. What would you do if she contacts you again? I'd be very interested to hear more of her concerns, Helen said with a slight smile, and I'd be very careful to document exactly what she says and when she says it. Someone making accusations about child endangerment should be prepared to back them up with facts. As I drove home that afternoon, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 8 months. Hope. Not desperate hope, but the steady confidence that comes from watching an elaborate lie begin to unravel. Claire had gotten overconfident. She'd tried to manipulate someone who actually knew me, someone with the professional experience to recognize lies and the personal knowledge to refute them. And in doing so, she'd revealed the true nature of her accusations. More importantly, she'd done it in front of someone who could serve as a credible witness if this ever went further. I pulled into my parking space and sat for a moment, thinking about the woman Claire had been 8 months ago versus the woman I'd seen today. The mask was starting to slip. The pressure of maintaining her lies for so long, combined with the confidence that came from seemingly getting away with it, was making her reckless, and reckless people made mistakes. The question now was whether David would be able to see those mistakes when they happened, or if Claire had programmed him too thoroughly to accept her version of reality. But for the first time since this nightmare began, I believed that the truth might actually have a chance. The call came on a Thursday morning in November, exactly 12 months after Claire had kicked me out of David's house. I was at the library, helping Mrs. Patterson research her family genealogy, when my phone buzzed with my son's name. For a moment, I just stared at it. 12 months of silence, and now this. Hello? I answered, my voice steadier than my hands. Mom. David's voice sounded different, strained, uncertain. I need to talk to you. Are you free for coffee today? Something in his tone made my chest tighten. This wasn't the David who had asked me to leave his house a year ago. This was the David I remembered from his childhood, the one who called me when he was scared or confused. Of course, I said. Where? That little place on Maple Street? The one we used to go to when I was in high school? Rosie's Cafe. Where I'd taken him after his basketball games, where we'd talked through college applications and girlfriend problems and dreams for the future. The fact that he'd chosen this place told me something significant was happening. I'll be there in 20 minutes, I said. I found David sitting in our old booth in the back corner, hunched over a cup of coffee that looked untouched. He'd lost weight, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. When he looked up and saw me, something crumpled in his expression. "Mom," he said, and his voice broke on the word. I slid into the booth across from him, fighting every instinct that wanted to reach across and touch his hand. 12 months of silence had taught me to be careful with hope. "What's going on, sweetheart?" I asked gently. David stared at his coffee for a long moment. "I think I've made a terrible mistake. Maybe the worst mistake of my life." I waited, letting him find his words. "Claire's pregnant," he said finally. 5 months along. "We're having a boy." I felt a complex mix of emotions. Joy at the thought of a grandchild. Sadness that I'd missed 5 months of this pregnancy. And worry about what this meant for David's awakening to Claire's true nature. "Congratulations," I said carefully. "That's wonderful news." "Is it?" David looked up at me, and I saw such pain in his eyes. "Mom, I don't know what's real anymore. I don't know what to believe." "What happened?" David rubbed his face with both hands. It started small. Little things that didn't add up. Like last month, Claire told me she'd run into your old supervisor at the grocery store, and that Mrs. Henderson had expressed concerns about your mental stability. My heart began to race. "What did she say exactly?" "That Mrs. Henderson had mentioned you'd been acting strangely at work, that you'd been making concerning comments about money and children." David looked at me directly. "But then I saw Mrs. Henderson at the bank a week later, and when I mentioned it to her, she had no idea what I was talking about. She said she'd never spoken to Claire about you at all." I kept my expression neutral, but inside I was celebrating. Claire's web of lies was starting to unravel, just as I'd hoped it would. "When I confronted Claire about it," David continued, "she said she must have confused Mrs. Henderson with someone else. She seemed genuinely embarrassed about the mix-up. But then, it happened again." "What happened again?" "She told me she'd gotten a call from Aunt Linda, expressing concerns about your isolation and asking if we thought you needed professional help. But when I called Linda to follow up, she said she'd never called Claire. In fact, she said Claire had called her months ago, asking strange questions about your mental health." I thought about my sister's call a year ago, about how angry Linda had been at Claire's manipulation. It seemed Linda had kept track of Claire's lies better than Claire had. "David," I said gently, "what do you think is happening?" "I think," he stopped, swallowed hard. "I think my wife has been lying to me about you, systematically. For months, maybe from the beginning." The waitress came by to refill our coffees, giving David a moment to compose himself. When she left, he continued. "Yesterday was the final straw. Claire came home from grocery shopping and told me she'd run into Helen Morrison, the head librarian from downtown. She said Helen had pulled her aside to express concerns about you, that you'd been acting erratically at library events, and that Helen was worried you might be having some kind of breakdown." My pulse quickened. This was it, the moment I'd been waiting for. "But here's the thing, Mom. I've known Helen Morrison since I was a teenager. She's like family to us, so I called her to thank her for looking out for you, to ask if there was anything I could do to help." I held my breath. Helen was confused. She said she had run into Claire at the grocery store, but that Claire had been the one making accusations about you. Helen said Claire had claimed you were mentally unstable and potentially dangerous around children. Helen was so upset about it that she'd been planning to call me herself. David's hands were shaking as he picked up his coffee cup. "Helen told me she'd known you for 15 years, that you were one of the most stable, ethical people she'd ever worked with. She said the idea of you being dangerous around children was not just wrong, but offensive to anyone who knew your work history." "What did you do then?" I asked quietly. "I hung up and sat in my car for 2 hours, trying to make sense of it all. Then I went home and asked Claire to explain the discrepancy between what she'd told me and what Helen had said." "How did she respond?" David's laugh was bitter. "She said Helen was lying, that Helen had always been jealous of our family's success and was probably trying to cause problems between us. She said older women like Helen sometimes become vindictive when they feel left out of family situations." The description was so absurd, so clearly a desperate attempt to discredit a credible witness, that I almost felt sorry for Claire. Almost. "But that's when I knew," David continued. Helen Morrison has never been jealous of anything in her life. She's one of the most generous, honest people I know. The idea that she would lie to cause problems in my marriage is insane." He looked at me with tears in his eyes. "Mom, I started thinking about everything Claire had told me about you over the past year. The financial desperation, the mental instability, the concerning comments about children. And I realized I'd never witnessed any of it myself. Every single piece of evidence about your supposed problems came from Claire. What else did you realize? That for the past year, every time I thought about calling you or visiting you, Claire found a reason why it was a bad idea. She said you needed space to work through your issues, that contact from me might make your obsessive tendencies worse, that I needed to focus on our new family instead of enabling your problems. I felt a mixture of sadness and vindication. This was exactly the pattern Michael had described, exactly what Dorothy had witnessed with Claire's previous victim. "David," I said gently, "do you remember the last conversation we had before I left your house?" He closed his eyes. "You were trying to tell me something, about knowing who you were, about our relationship, and I cut you off. I told you that people change when they get desperate. Do you remember what you were like as a child? Do you remember our relationship then? You were everything to me," he whispered. "After Dad died, you worked 3 jobs to keep me in school. You never missed a game or a performance. You taught me to drive, helped me with college applications, listened to me talk about girls for hours without getting bored." He opened his eyes and looked at me. "You were the most loving, stable person in my world. What changed, David? What made you believe I could suddenly become someone who would harm children?" "Claire," he said simply. "Claire changed everything. She convinced me that grief had made you unstable, that your financial situation had made you desperate, that I needed to protect my future family from you." He shook his head. "God, Mom, what kind of son believes his mother is capable of selling children? A son whose reality has been systematically manipulated by an expert," I said. "David, this isn't your fault, isn't it? I chose to believe her over my own memories of you. I chose to protect a wife I'd known for 2 years over a mother who'd spent 37 years proving her love for me." I reached across the table and took his hand. He didn't pull away. "What are you going to do?" I asked. "I don't know. She's carrying my son. We're married. But Mom, I can't trust anything she says anymore. Every conversation we have, I find myself wondering what she's really trying to accomplish." He squeezed my hand. "I've been living with someone who's been lying to me about the most important relationship in my life. How do I come back from that?" Carefully, I said, "David, I need to tell you some things about Claire, things I learned after I left your house. But I want you to understand that I'm not telling you this to hurt you or to force you to make any particular choice. I'm telling you because you have a right to know who you're married to." Over the next hour, I told David everything. About Dorothy's revelations, about Michael and the investigator's report, about Claire's real name and her history of manipulation. I showed him the notebook I'd been keeping, the documentation of her systematic campaign against me. David listened in horrified silence as the full scope of his wife's deception became clear. "She's done this before," he said finally. "Multiple times." "Yes, and David, I think you need to know, the pattern usually ends with the man being financially drained or with Claire finding a better target and disappearing. But this time is different. Because she's pregnant. Because she's trapped. She can't disappear and start over with someone new while she's carrying your child. She has to see this through, at least until the baby is born." David was quiet for a long time, processing the implications. "What do I do now?" he asked finally. "That's up to you. But David, whatever you decide, please be careful. Claire has invested too much in this relationship to give up easily, and people like her can become dangerous when they feel cornered." As we prepared to leave, David hugged me for the first time in a year. It felt like coming home. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered against my shoulder. "I'm so sorry for everything." "I know, sweetheart. I forgave you months ago. How do I fix this? How do I make up for a year of believing terrible things about you?" "You don't have to make up for anything," I said. You just have to decide what kind of life you want going forward. And whatever you decide, I'll support you." As I drove home that afternoon, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 12 months. Peace. Not the peace of resignation I'd found in my exile, but the peace that comes from truth finally being acknowledged. David knew now. The son I'd raised to be thoughtful and kind was still there underneath the programming Claire had installed. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I had hope that my family might actually be salvageable. But I also knew that Claire wouldn't give up without a fight. The next few months would test everything: David's resolve, my patience, and Claire's desperation. The war wasn't over, but finally I wasn't fighting it alone. 15 months had passed since Claire first accused me of being capable of selling children, and I was sitting in my grandson's nursery, watching David paint the final coat on the wooden rocking chair he'd built by hand. Tommy had been born 3 weeks ago, a perfect, healthy baby with David's dark eyes and what I hoped would be my stubborn determination. The past few months had been a careful dance of strategy, patience, and love. After our conversation at Rosie's Cafe, David had returned home with a plan. Instead of confronting Claire directly about her lies, he'd begun documenting everything, just as I had taught him. Every story she told, every claim she made, every attempt to isolate him from me or from anyone else who might question her narrative. It hadn't taken long for the pattern to become undeniable. Claire had tried to convince David that his college roommate Jake was jealous of their happiness, after Jake had asked innocent questions about why David never mentioned his mother anymore. She'd claimed that their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Kim, was spreading gossip about their family when Mrs. Kim had simply asked how I was doing. She'd even suggested that David's boss was creating a hostile work environment when he'd mentioned missing me during a casual conversation about family. The common thread was always the same. Anyone who expressed fondness for me or questioned my absence from David's life was suddenly painted as a problem that needed to be managed or eliminated. But Claire's most fatal error had come just 2 weeks before Tommy's birth. She'd told David that I had called her directly, begging to be allowed back into their lives and making concerning statements about what I might do if I continued to be denied access to my grandson. According to Claire, I had become obsessed with the idea of being a grandmother and was making veiled threats about exposing family secrets if I wasn't included. David had listened to this story with the patience he'd learned from me, then done something Claire hadn't expected. He'd asked to hear the threatening voicemail I'd supposedly left. Claire had claimed she'd deleted it out of fear, not wanting to preserve evidence of my deteriorating mental state, but she'd offered to call me immediately and try to record me making similar threats. That's when David had told her he'd been in contact with me for months. The explosion that followed had revealed everything about who Claire really was. Gone was the sweet, concerned wife. In her place stood a woman capable of cold, calculated rage. She'd screamed at David about being ungrateful and weak, about how she'd saved him from my toxic influence, about how I would destroy their family if he let me back in. Most tellingly, she'd threatened to leave him and take the baby somewhere I would never find them. The mask had finally come off completely. David had recorded that conversation on his phone. When Claire realized what she'd revealed about herself, she'd tried to backtrack, to return to her victim narrative, but it was too late. David had heard the real Claire, the one who viewed his love for his mother as a weakness to be exploited rather than a strength to be respected. The divorce proceedings had been swift. Claire's lawyer had tried to argue for primary custody based on her original claims about my instability. But David's documentation of her lies, combined with testimonies from Helen Morrison, Mrs. Henderson, and even Michael, had painted a clear picture of systematic psychological manipulation. Claire had ultimately agreed to joint custody in exchange for David not pursuing charges for defamation or psychological abuse. She'd moved back to her parents in another state, claiming she needed support during this difficult time. I suspected she was already searching for her next target. "What are you thinking about, Mom?" David asked, settling into the matching chair he'd built for himself. "Just how quiet it is," I said, adjusting Tommy in my arms. He was sleeping peacefully, tiny fingers curled around my thumb with a grip that reminded me of David at this age. "Quiet is good," David said. I'd forgotten what it felt like to not be constantly questioning every conversation, every interaction, every feeling. The past year had been difficult for David, learning that his marriage had been built on lies, that his wife had systematically isolated him from everyone who loved him, had shaken his confidence in his own judgment. He'd started therapy, something I fully supported, and was slowly rebuilding his trust in his own perceptions. "Do you regret it?" I asked gently. "Any of it?" David considered this, watching his son sleep. "I regret the time we lost. I regret believing someone else's version of who you were instead of trusting my own memories. I regret that Tommy will grow up in a broken home because his father was too naive to see through his mother's manipulation. But do you regret that it happened at all?" He looked at me curiously. "What do you mean?" "I mean, if Claire hadn't come into our lives, if she hadn't done what she did, would you be the man you are today? Would I be the woman I am today?" David was quiet for a long moment. "You're different," he said finally. "Stronger somehow. More. Settled in yourself." He was right. The year of exile had changed me in ways I was still discovering. I'd learned that I could survive betrayal by the person I loved most in the world. I'd learned that my worth wasn't dependent on anyone else's recognition of it. I'd learned that patience and documentation were more powerful than confrontation and drama. Most importantly, I'd learned that I didn't need to be anyone other than who I was. "Being kicked out of your house was the worst thing that had ever happened to me," I told David. "It was also, in some ways, the best thing." "How can you say that?" "Because it forced me to discover who I was when everything familiar was stripped away. It taught me that love without boundaries isn't love at all. It's enabling. It showed me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to participate in someone else's dysfunction." Tommy stirred in my arms, making the soft sounds that meant he'd be waking soon. I looked down at this perfect little person who would never know a world where his grandmother was considered dangerous, who would grow up understanding that real love meant honesty and respect and trust. "There's something else," I said to David. "Something I need you to understand." "What's that?" "I don't need you to spend the rest of your life making up for what happened. I don't need elaborate apologies or constant reassurance that you know who I really am. What I need is for you to build a life based on truth, for yourself and for Tommy." David's eyes filled with tears. "I just feel like I failed you so completely." "You didn't fail me, sweetheart. You got manipulated by an expert. There's a difference." I shifted Tommy to my other arm. "Claire chose you specifically because you were trusting and loyal and good. Those aren't character flaws, David. Those are exactly the qualities I hoped you'd have when I raised you. But they made me vulnerable. They made you human. And now that you know how manipulation works, you'll be better equipped to protect yourself and Tommy from people who would exploit those qualities." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching Tommy sleep and listening to the normal sounds of a normal afternoon. A dog barking in the distance, children playing in the park across the street, the gentle hum of everyday life continuing around us. "I've been thinking about something," David said eventually. "What's that?" "I want to put together a fund. Something to help other people who've been victims of this kind of psychological abuse. Maybe work with Michael and that investigator he hired to create resources for people who are dealing with manipulative partners or family members." I smiled, recognizing the son I'd raised in this impulse to turn pain into purpose. "That sounds like a wonderful way to honor what we've all learned. Would you be interested in helping? You could share your story, show other people that it's possible to survive this kind of betrayal and come out stronger." The idea appealed to me more than I'd expected. For so long, I'd felt like Claire's victim. The thought of becoming someone who could help other victims felt like a final victory over everything she'd tried to take from me. "I'd like that," I said, "but on one condition." "What's that?" "We tell the whole truth, not just about the manipulation and the lies, but about the recovery, about how long it takes to rebuild trust, about how much work it is to separate truth from fiction after you've been gaslit for months or years." I looked at him seriously. "And about how it's possible to come out of it with more self-respect and peace than you had before." Tommy woke up then, blinking his dark eyes and looking around the nursery with the serious expression that seemed to be his default. When his gaze found mine, he smiled. His first real smile, the one the pediatrician had said might happen around this time. "Look at that," David said softly. He knows his grandmother. I felt tears start in my eyes, but they were tears of joy, not sadness. This little boy would know me as I really was, not as Claire's distorted version of me. He would grow up with a grandmother who had been tested by betrayal and had chosen dignity over bitterness, patience over revenge, truth over comfortable lies. "You know what I'm most grateful for?" I said to David as I stood to change Tommy's diaper. "What's that?" "That when the truth finally came out, when you ran into my arms like you did that day at the cafe, I was still the same person you remembered. Claire tried to change me, to make me smaller and more desperate and more afraid. But she failed." I lifted Tommy onto the changing table, marveling at his perfect tiny fingers and toes. She thought exile would break me. Instead, it taught me exactly how strong I really was. David joined me at the changing table, helping me with the snaps on Tommy's sleeper. "What do you think happened to her? To Claire, I mean." "I think she's probably already found someone new to target. Someone else who'll believe her stories about crazy ex-husbands and toxic families." I secured Tommy's clean diaper and picked him up, but that's not our concern anymore. Don't you ever wonder, though? Don't you ever want to warn whoever comes next? I considered this as I settled back into the rocking chair with Tommy. It was a question I'd asked myself many times over the past few months. "I used to think about that," I said finally. But then I realized that trying to save Claire's future victims would mean staying connected to her story, staying invested in her choices. And I refused to give her that much space in my life. That seems very wise. It took me a long time to get there. For months I fantasized about exposing her publicly, about making sure everyone knew what she was capable of. But that would have been about revenge, not justice. And revenge would have made me smaller, not stronger. The afternoon sun was streaming through the nursery windows, casting everything in golden light. Tommy had fallen back asleep in my arms, completely trusting and completely safe. David was sketching designs for a toy box he wanted to build, humming softly under his breath. This was what victory looked like, I realized. Not Claire's destruction or public humiliation, but this quiet afternoon with my son and grandson, building something real and honest and good together. "Mom?" David said without looking up from his sketching. "Yes? I love you, and I'm proud to be your son." The words settled into my heart like a blessing. 15 months ago, I'd stood in a hallway being accused of crimes against my own grandchildren. Today, I was holding that grandchild while his father told me he was proud to be my son. "I love you too, sweetheart," I said, "and I'm proud of the man you've become." Outside, life continued its normal rhythm, but inside this nursery, in this moment, everything was exactly as it should be. I had my family back. I had my dignity intact. I had peace that nobody could take away from me. Claire had tried to destroy me, but instead, she had revealed exactly how indestructible I really was, and that was worth everything.